a small one, a small version. Could be.
Good afternoon once again. I'm just trying to remind those who came after me lately. The lecture is delayed at the moment due to train troubles coming from Cambridge. So we have delayed it by about 15 minutes. It should start at 2:30. So bear with us. The house work, the toilets are to your right, this way, as your right hand, right?
That's way left.
The back floor, back to right again. Can I invite everyone to take their seats? We're going to start in about 2 minutes. Please, thank you. Please take your seats. And I will hand over. Thank you. Barbadians, friends of Barbados, good evening and welcome to this Errol Barrow celebration event. Dermot event today. You're all very welcome. I'm quite surprised at the turnout because when it was originally conceptualized, we didn't think that we would get as many people, so it's really heartening to see you all out. And this is what essentially is a community event, and CBA, books and things, the stall at the back. And just to say a word about books and things, it's a give back group, so any profits that are made from books and things is given towards charitable projects in Barbados. And last year we did hampers to Barbados. Last year we did hampers to Barbados in conjunction with Barbados Overseas and Family and Friends Association. So it's spend your money. Some very good authors there. Please enjoy it. I'd like to acknowledge a few people in the room. I know I have lots. All of you are distinguished guests, but I would like to acknowledge our former High Commissioner, Father Guy Hewitt, please. And he's going to kill me for saying that. But Alan Smith, who was Alan Smith is a cricketer who I love dearly. So we're going to have a little light entertainment to make you relax before Professor Richard starts his lecture. And it's my delight to introduce a lady by the name of Michelle Bain, who is currently an English lecturer at Lewisham College. She's married to Stephen, I think he's sitting next to her, who joyfully accepts her need to know more about everyone and everything which she explains is research. She's malicious. She has two sons in their early 20s who both know better than to criticize their lovely mother. She enjoys writing and believes everyone has a history to tell. She talks to her mother who lives in Barbados every evening and often manages to get Mum to reminisce about her life growing up in Dextree Hill in St. Peter. Michelle would like to win the Booker Prize, but needs to write the book first. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michelle Bain.
Thank you, everybody. Oh my goodness. Right, now, as Tyrone said, I talk to my mum every evening. We have a particular time in the evening where we FaceTime each other, and she often reminisces and tells me a lot about how she grew up in Barbados. She's 87 years old now, so what I'm trying to do is chronicle some of the stories that she talks and she tells me about, you know, in terms of history, because it is part of our history. So, this particular story I've entitled, So My Mother Often Tells Me Stories. My mum, like so many of our Barbadian elders, is a gem. Mum tells me lots of great stories. Some are funny, some are sad. Some are intended to teach a life lesson or send a message. They're never downright gypsy or malicious though. I bet you're disappointed to hear that. Especially since she was born in Boscobel and grew up in Dextree Hill, St. Peter. Oh, can I have a quick show of hands? Who's from St. Peter? Yeah. Yeah? Yeah, so hopefully some of you will know, well, there's a bus that goes to, from town to Boscobel, so it's at the end of a bus route, so everybody, hopefully, if they haven't heard of Boscobel before, by the end of this story, they know Boscobel. Okay, so you'd expect her to have some salacious stories, wouldn't you? Because you know what those Boscobel people are like. And they say the ones that live near St. Peter Alley are the worst. Like so many of her generation, Mum came to Britain in the 1950s. Everyone who was able to was leaving Barbados to come here. So it must have been really weird when that first surge of people left. I can't begin to imagine how many cows and sheep were left to stray in the pastures, and how many buckets of water from the standpipe were left uncollected. As those tasks were handed down to younger and less responsible siblings, who probably already had their hands full with other chores. Now take, for example, Jemima Green. She cried so bad when her older sister Gracie was leaving for England. It wasn't that she'd miss her because it meant that she'd have that single bed all to herself. She was thinking more about the chores that she'd have to do and how she wouldn't be able to borrow her older sister's clothes. You know, Bajans love to gather as a crowd, probably because they like a little gossip. Well, who doesn't? But Bajans aren't even subtle about it, really. Mum told me that on the morning Gracie Green was leaving, everybody came out of their houses to see her off. They wanted to see what she looked like when she got into one of only 2 cars that were in the district. Comments filled the air like, "You look good, gal. She could have made that skirt a little longer. She could soon come home with a big belly." And advice like, "Read your Bible and you're going to be just fine." Gracie's so-called boyfriend, Frederick, held the car door open and she blew him a kiss as she was just about to get in. Cutie Johnson was passing and Cutie sucked her teeth and said, "I ain't know why she kissing he. As she gone, he go on she." Gracie ignored her. However, according to Mum's sources, Gracie got the last laugh when she arrived at Waterloo Station 2 weeks later. And she saw Cutie's boyfriend. His name was Cyril, and Cyril met her off the boat train as he and the other fellows formed a welcoming party to meet the new arrivals. Now, for those of you who don't know, there was a train that brought all the new arrivals and the passengers that came off the boat into Waterloo Station, and they'd usually be met by families and friends or by employers to complete their journey. So, you know, whenever the boat train came in, lots of West Indians would make their way to the station to see if anyone was coming that they knew. And that was the thing about the United Kingdom. People had to get together. The cold air must have made men braver as they approached women who they knew were out of their league. And some women thought it would be okay just to settle once they saw the cost of living over here. I mean, look at Gracie and Cyril. They used to call him Shake a Leg, because if he'd hear a knock top, or a top knock I should say, he would start dancing. He could dance to the sound of raindrops then. Gracie was a quiet type and didn't like dances or parties. You wouldn't think they'd have had a lot in common. Gracie went to Alexandra, but Cyril left Boscobel Boys at 13 to take up a carpentry apprenticeship. However, he got let go because he thought a foot was 10 inches. And he kept cutting the wood short. Okay. But you know what? It was access to the education that was in short supply, often for the poorer members of the community. Which makes me think about how my mum tells me about my maternal grandmother. Her name was Reenie, and she was the first in our family line to be able to read and write. Now, she had an older sister called Edith, affectionately known as Bet, who had also been sent to school, but she didn't quite make it. The lure of Miss Gemmett's bread shop en route meant that the penny fee that had to be paid for lessons was used to purchase bread, cakes and biscuits instead. My great aunt often told my mum that she ate up her education. But you know what? She wasn't the only one. There was a man called, hang on, I better make up the name because, you know, we want to protect people's identities here. Let's say this man was called Albert Johnson. Obviously not his real name. Have we got any lawyers in the house? Sorry? Right, so if I start to sort of like sound as if I'm going to slant someone, start waving at me, yeah? But anyway, this guy, his name was Albert Johnson, yeah? He also lived in Boscobel, and just like my great aunt, ate out his pennyworth of education. However, with his hungry belly, he decided that he had ambitions to come to Britain and seek his fortune. My mum said that Mr. Johnson left Barbados around 1957. Well, of course, with everyone coming to Britain, he had to have the experience too. But everyone agreed that Britain was drab, everyone everywhere looked the same, the streets were identical, all the houses had red bricks and black or green doors, and not even a splash of warm or pastel colours to be seen. Well, we're not sure whether Mr. Johnson knew that not being able to read or write would be a disadvantage, but we knew that that wasn't going to stop him. So he decided he was going to live and work in London Down. He and his wife found lodgings in a large Victorian house in Paddington that he shared with another Beijing couple, a Ghanaian law student, and an Irish waitress. So, he'd only been in London for a few days when he said to his wife, "Wifey, I'm going out today. Maybe I'm going to look for a job." She replied, "I'll be out when you get back, but I'll cook before I go, and I can left you a share of food in the kitchen." So, he left home on this particular morning, started walking the streets, and he realised he didn't know where he was. I think that's the point where we could say, "Good dear. Good dear." He was lost, and he forgot to bring the slip of paper that his wife had written the address on. And he also couldn't remember the name of the street. And even more unfortunate was the fact he couldn't read the street names anyway. "I really should have learned to read and write, but Miss Gemma did taste sweet for sore," he thought. So he walked the streets all day long. The rain pelted down, and he found a bus shelter. The sun came back out again, and he continued to roam the streets, feeling increasingly defeated and deflated. As dusk began to fall, and he was feeling really down and dejected, I think this is another point for a Kadir. He stood on the street corner, looking bewildered. Another man, also a Bajan, approached him and asked him how his day was and how he was doing. He replied, "Man, I've been walking back all day long and can't find my way back home. I ain't know where he is right now." The man looked him up and down and leaned in and whispered, "That is what happened when you're too licorice. You should have paid your penny and learned to read and write." Nah, not really. The man smiled at him and said, "That's okay, because I saw what part you come from this morning. And if you swing up so and keep going straight, and go yonder until you reach the third lamppost and swing left and go down, you can see an old grey dustbin. If you swing right so, you can be just by Miss Braffett's house, and you live next door to she." At this point, Albert realised he was never going to find his way back home. Kadir. He was as lost as a lamb without a shepherd to tuck him under his rescuing arm, as lonely as a boat adrift in high waters without a lighthouse to guide him. This was when Albert Johnson shed a long, salty, desperate tear. Yeah, this is a Kadir moment, isn't it? Kadir. I'm only joking. The man introduced himself as Mr. Errol Hines and reassured him, saying, "Well, that is okay, because I saw what part you come from this morning, and I can carry you back home." Which he did. Albert couldn't believe his luck. On the way home, they talked about how dull and drab London was, how everything looked so similar, and Albert and Errol vowed to add some vibrancy to this monochrome city. So when he reached the door, Albert searched for his keys. He felt so relieved after his day that the tears in his eyes meant he couldn't find them and he couldn't see to put the key in the keyhole. So he decided to make his way round to the side entrance, where he was able to push open the door, and there he found himself in the kitchen. He saw the food laid out on the table and felt overwhelmed once more. And he was so full of emotion, he said to himself, "Wow, I know my wife said she left me some food, but she really surpassed herself this time." There was a big chicken pie, carrots, peas, potatoes, and to his joy, it looked like there'd be tinned peaches and evaporated milk for dessert. A bit of a change from the split peas and rice I did expecting. All this food for me? Britain is great after all. He tucked into his splendid feast until he heard footsteps. Before he could swallow the next delectable mouthful, he was confronted by a blonde English woman wearing a pink baby doll nightdress. She screamed at the stranger in her house, saying, "Ah, what are you doing in my house? Eating my husband's birthday tea." That was when Albert Johnson realized that he was, in fact, in the house next door. What happened next is another story for some other time. So thank you all very much for listening to me this afternoon. Thank you.
Well done, Michelle. An excellent effort. By the way, what I omitted to thank, I also have to thank the vicar, Father Philip Corbett, and his team for allowing us to use the church as well. Thank you for that. Right, now to the serious bit. Richard Drayton was born in Guyana and grew up in Barbados. He was educated at Harvard, Oxford, and wrote his PhD at Yale. From 1992 to 94, he was a junior research fellow at St. Catherine's in Cambridge. 1994 to 1998, Darby Fellow and tutor in modern history at Lincoln College, Oxford. And in 1998 to 2001, associate professor of Black history at the University of Virginia Virginia. In 2001, he returned from Cambridge as university lecturer in Imperial and Extra-European History and Fellow of Corpus Christi. And from 2009, the 6th Rose Professor of Imperial and Global History at King's College London. In 2001, this is a funny one, he won the Forscosh Prize of the American Historical Association. In 2002, the Philip Leverhulme Prize, and in 2021 was awarded the Humboldt Prize in recognition of his lifetime research achievements. In 2016, he received the Barbados Jubilee Honor in recognition of his services to Barbados in the United Kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, let's bring to the podium Professor Richard Drayton.
Thank you very much, Tyrone. Fellow citizens, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I want first to thank the National Council of Barbadian Associations, Bajan Hub UK, the DLP United Kingdom, and Books and Things for bringing us together in this sacred space in more than one sense of All Saints Church in Notting Hill. It is always a special pleasure and privilege to gather with you to celebrate Barbados. And there's no more powerful symbol of the meaning of Barbados than Errol Barrow, who was born on this day in 1920. Now, I was barely 20 years old when Barrow died in 1987, a little bit over 20. So I imagine that for anyone younger than me, you would have very little sense of who he was and what he meant, except for his role in taking Barbados to independence in 1966. In the 30 minutes I have with you, I want today to try to bring him to life for you, to give you a sense of this extraordinary human being. In 1970, a British diplomat penned a portrait of Barrow in his prime, and I quote, "Barrow is to be seen everywhere in this country. One day he's aqualugging with the underwater boys, and then he's attending their annual dinner. Next morning we can be buzzed by the Prime Minister flying himself on a tour of inspection of Barbados. Sometime during the week, he may be either buying or selling a cow, and he will certainly be driving himself around in a Vauxhall Viva or an 1100, shunning chauffeur and ceremony. At 5:30 in the morning, he can on occasion be seen riding down Broad Street on his bay mare or shooting duck. He will perhaps lunch at the American Businessmen's Club. He will have appointments all the morning. He will often work late in the office over the weekend and will take time off to visit his extramural companion. In the Barbados I knew as a child, it was not just that all roads led to Bridgetown. It was said that all roads led to Barrow. At Colonial Farm, his official residence, he'd receive both trade unionists and big businessmen. While at his beach house, Kampala by Paradise Beach, he would hold court with Gordon Lewis, the political scientist, and George Lamming, the novelist, and Nina Simone, the jazz singer. George described visiting once Colonial Farm, and Barrow saying excitedly, "Come, come, I have something to show you." George, imagining that it was some text or speech he was writing, was instead presented to a handsome pig, which the Prime Minister was rearing in his backyard. You would see Errol Barrow at the supermarket pushing his cart like anyone else, and he routinely stopped when driving to give lifts to people walking along the road. He had great emotional range, able to thunder and joke at a political platform, to hold his own in a rum shop, or to speak with eloquence to an international audience. He carried a profound self-confidence, a pride so deeply rooted that it gave him a humility of manners and style. He carried himself lightly because he was so deeply conscious of his weight. No Barbadian I have known has so clearly carried within him or herself that sense of history, and perhaps even of mission and destiny that one felt in Errol Barrow. In his foreword to the Barbados Independence issue of New World Quarterly in 1966, Barrow declared, "We in Barbados are part of a worldwide movement which in the post-war period has brought freedom to subject peoples in Africa, Asia, South America, and the Caribbean. Like the peoples of these areas, we are waging a war against poverty and unemployment, and against all the accompanying social and economic ills. In the face of manifold odds, we're struggling to transform our economy from being colonial and backward-looking into one which is modern and progressive. It is my sincere hope that independence will release in our people a sense of deep pride in their country, a feeling of being one people, and a self-confidence that we can overcome all the obstacles that stand in the way of personal realization." Note Barrow's use of the present and future tenses, waging, struggling, and will release. Note too his sense that we acquired political sovereignty while lacking pride and confidence, and as a fractured people. He did not think, and we should never think, of independence as having been achieved in 1966. Independence was not a date, but a process and a project of self-emancipation, for which democratic command of the state was the means, but not the end. To understand that and his meaning, we need to turn to his origins, to the roots of that war which he declared in 1966 he was waging. In the Barbados into which Barrow was born, of every 1,000 babies who were born, about a third of them could be expected to die before the age of 1. Life expectancy at birth was 40 years of age. Colonial society in Barbados was a regime of mass manslaughter based on low wages and a state which spent the minimum on public services and welfare. In 1690, Dalby Thomas, an Englishman, wrote that sugar had contributed more to the pleasure, glory, and grandeur of England than any other commodity we deal in or produce. But there was little to show in Barbados for the river of wealth which the island had sent to Barbados over 300 years and had vested in the Coddingtons and the Draxes and their equivalents. Only 10% of the adult males earned enough to qualify to vote, so that the planter and merchant elite who mastered its economy also ruled its parliament and made laws to suit themselves. They ensured that taxes on capital and on property and on income remained low, and that taxes instead fell on the consumption of livelihood, of food and other sorts of livelihood by the poor. So the poor were essentially being made to pay for this colonial apparatus which rested on top of them, and made to pay even for the police which terrorized them. That minority's command of most arable land, even of the ground on which the labourers built their chattel homes, the notorious tenantries, allowed them to set the terms of the labour market. Essentially, if you gave too much trouble on the plantation, you would be made homeless. You and your family would be sent wandering the streets to goodness knows what end. So this gave capital in that society the capacity to drive down wages in real terms over time. At the end of slavery in 1838, the wages paid to field workers were $1 a day. Would you believe that 100 years later, in 1938, as was discovered by the commission investigating the 1937 riots, field workers were still being paid $1 a day? And indeed, the wages had been driven down in the 1890s during the agricultural crisis, down to 9p a day. And of course, this is in the context of a continual increase in the cost of the things needed for people to live. So this is a regime in which people are literally dying young because they cannot feed themselves. From this economic power stemmed a regime of fear. Economic vulnerability, far more than the state's capacity to use violence, has provided the most powerful discipline over social and political expression in Barbados, during and indeed after the colonial period. You can always be starved out. The Barbadian planter, George Carrington, in his testimony to West India Royal Commission of 1897, calmly described how the regime worked. He says, you know, the Barbadian Negroes are most civil as a rule, especially in the daylight, to us and to the managers. But you'll see the same man go down to Demerara. So he's migrating to British Guyana, where labour is more valuable and less dense. And he will stand and look at the manager and whistle in his face and cheek him in any kind of way. It is that in Barbados we have such an ample command of the labour, there's such a lot of them, that they must work and behave themselves. In Carrington's pronouns, we, the planter class, you, the British government, and them, the labouring poor, we find a grid of a system of exploitation and oppression from which the only escape was emigration. To British Guyana in the 19th century, to Panama after 1900, and to Cuba in the United States in the teens, 20s and 30s, and to Britain after 1945. And from these places of safety, to fight perhaps from a distance. Many of you in this room were part of or descendants of those who took flight from the hunger, poverty, and limited opportunities, which was the experience of most Barbadians throughout the colonial period. It is significant to the Barrow story that he understood this experience from both the inside and the outside. His own father, Reginald Barrow, who was an ordained Anglican priest, was driven out of Barbados, essentially. He was a bit too troublesome. He was essentially kept in a condition of semi-poverty. So he took a post in St. Croix to work for the American Episcopal Church, St. Croix having just been purchased by the United States by the Danes. But he becomes swept up in the currents of radical politics which spread around the world, and in particular in the African diaspora after 1918 and 19. He is swept up by the politics of Garveyism and by the trade union movement. By the early 1920s, the governor of the Virgin Islands deports Reginald Barrow, who takes flight and moves to New York. So that Barrow knew what it meant to be driven from pillar to post if one took a particular position on the order of things. And of course, the main influence who was perhaps most important in his life was his uncle, his mother's brother, Charles Duncan O'Neill, who in the course of the 1920s and early 1930s, before his very early death, in the late 1930s, was involved in organizing the Barbados Working Men's Association and the Democratic League, organizations which sought to organize working people to secure better wages and working conditions, and to force the government of the day to create a society which would serve the interests of the broadest majority of the people. But he could see, and indeed his own O'Neill relatives could see, the price which Charles Duncan O'Neill paid for this. Barrow remembered that when he was a small child, he remembered O'Neill living in a lovely house with beautiful rose bushes which he tended. But when he took up his political cause, he essentially no longer could receive patients who would pay him the private fees which would keep him as a doctor. He ended up having to sell that house and to live in the surgery from which he conducted his business as a doctor. And the rest of the O'Neill family, in fact, viewed Charles Duncan O'Neill with contempt. And there's a matriarch of the family who considered O'Neill to be betraying the interests of the family. And that's because the O'Neill family were representative of that small, propertied, brown and black middle class which had emerged in Barbados in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Barrow famously declared on a platform in a variety of ways, "I was not born in a tenantry, I was born in a great house." By which he meant several things. I understand them. I don't come here with any sense of deference towards them. But he also was reminding us that he carried within him this particular class location within Barbadian society. Barrow understood, in other words, the conservatism which was part of that society, which he knew as intimately from his O'Neill family as he knew the spirit of rebellion from his uncle. We can see this ambivalent experience present in that great year of Barbadian history, 1937, when in the 26th of July 1937, in the wake of the deportation of Clement Payne, the great riots unfolded in Bridgetown and beyond Bridgetown, from which we date the beginnings of the modern trade union and national movement in Barbados. In the wake of the 1937 riots, Marcus Mosiah Garvey visits Barbados in August 1937, and Barrow reminisced later on in life on the profound impact which Garvey had made on him, not least, he said, when Garvey said that the problem with black men is they go to sleep too early and they wake up too late. And he said he took from that the life lesson that he would only sleep 5 hours a night to achieve all the things he wanted to achieve. But it's worth bearing in mind where Errol Barrow was in the immediate aftermath of the riots in July 1937. As a member of the Cadet Corps of Harrison College, he was equipped with a rifle and he was sent to Worthing, which was, as many of you will know, a middle-class white suburb, to protect him from rioters. This was in some way the role which colonial society was preparing for Errol Barrow. He was perceived as someone who was definitely going to be one of the leaders of his generation. And it's quite clear that I think that there were those among the colonial government in the island who sought to cultivate this man towards this role. It's certainly very striking that when he volunteers to join the Royal Air Force in 1939, he's given an extremely privileged career within the Royal Air Force. It's quite unusual that a colonial could end up as the personal navigator of the senior Air Marshal. Barrow was being groomed for a particular role. The colonial authorities imagined that this man who was coming to fight their war would fight their war back home in the colonies when peace was achieved. But they didn't realize that Barrow was fighting his own war, that war with which I began. I take you to a speech which Barrow gave in the House of Assembly when he called on Britain to convene the Barbados Independence Conference. This is a speech from January of 1966. And of course, for this speech, as for so many others, we have to thank the great Reverend Guy Hewitt for his work on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of independence in bringing together a collection of Errol Barrow speeches, which I encourage all of you to buy a copy of. Barrow said, "I am not going to go into a recital of what the British have done and what they've not done. Their relation with our people has not been a happy association. It has been a very unhappy association. And it's regrettable that we have some of the downtrodden who feel that they are now slightly privileged, fighting on the side of all these acts of inhumanity against our people. When I go to a conference and I want to tell the Secretary of State of the colonies to go to hell or to know his place, I tell him so because I know the premises and the position of strength from which I'm speaking. It's not a position of feeling inferior in any way. They are the people who should feel inferior, because they're the people who've broken every single law of morality as far as a relationship with us is concerned. If I have any sense of shame, it is a shame to know that in my country, there still exists an element that, despite all we've gone through, we still have people who are so degraded and people who are still so tantalized by the trappings of colonialism. I do not want my children to grow up as second-class citizens. And I don't want the children of any of the ladies who work for me in my house assisting us in the discharge of our daily duties, or the man who works in the garden, or the man who drives the proverbial omnibus, to grow up with any sense of inferiority to any persons. Now, this Barrow, speaking in 1966, was formed as much by what happened after 1945 as what happened before. Barrow was quite clearly marked by those extraordinary years which followed the Second World War, in which the degradation of European civilization at the hands of Germany was made visible in the course of the Nuremberg trials, and in which he and a whole generation of men and some women from around the colonies gathered in London at places like the LSE and the Inns of Court to imagine what the futures of their societies would be. So figures like Michael Manley from Jamaica, Forbes Burnham from Guyana, Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, and many others whose names we've now forgotten, who were imagining what could be done in the space of this new world that was unfolding, for which the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 and Burma and Ceylon in 1948 were the benchmarks. It was quite clear that the second half of the 20th century would be an era in which political independence could be forged if we dared. So this is what Barrow brings back to him, with him, when he comes back to Barbados from London at the beginning of the 1950s. He was already probably the most prominent war hero in the country. He was a man of eloquence and charm, with great amounts of social capital, and he was very quickly picked upon by the Barbados Labour Party to become one of their stalwarts of the next generation. And indeed, he is one of the authors, interestingly, of the 1951 Manifesto, which brought the Barbados Labour Party into power. But it did not take long before Barrow found himself uncomfortable in his relationship with Grantley Adams, the leader of the Barbados Labour Party. In part, this was a personal tension. Adams had a problem with young men not knowing their place. And he had ways of humiliating young men. And there are certain people who one does not humiliate, and one of them is Errol Barrow. So it was very quick before, it wasn't very long before Barrow decided essentially this was not a situation he was comfortable with. At the same time too, I think that there were, for Barrow and others in the society, there were considerable amounts of disquiet with the ways in which Grantley Adams in this period had attached himself to being the mouthpiece of Britain. So that those people in Barbados who, and I think here of Ulrich Grant, who was one of the great figures of the 1937 riots and who then became a key trade unionist in the Barbados Workers' Union, Carlton Gill, I think of Sleepy Smith, the young lawyer who had just returned, Theodore Brancker, and of course those on the other side of the house from Adams, Winter Crawford, and others who were unhappy about a number of things. They were unhappy about Adams's silence about the ways in which Britain was conducting its suppression of the Mau Mau insurgency in Kenya. They were unhappy with how Adams was supporting the suspension of the constitution of British Guyana and the removal of power of Chetty Jagan's government in 1953. And it's very striking that it's in 1953 that Grant and Gill met with Cameron Tudor and raised with him the idea of forming a new political party with Barrow, with Sleepy Smith, with Brancker, and the Congress. This, of course, is a period of anti-colonial awakening around the world, not just in Kenya, but also, or in British Guyana, but also in Malaya, also in Singapore, also across West Africa, in Ghana, Nigeria, and of course in Egypt itself with Nasser. This is the era of the great Bandung Conference, when the leaders of the anti-colonial world gathered in Indonesia to declare a future for the world which was not going to be under the tutelage of London or Paris or Washington. And in the same week this Bandung Conference was held, the decision was taken to form the Democratic Labour Party, and this was launched in Barbados. And this became the political vehicle to which Barrow was attached for the rest of his political career. The skill of Barrow in bringing together political coalitions was present at this early stage as it was earlier on. And he managed to bring together a kind of mixture of popular and middle-class interests, not entirely dissimilar from what Eric Williams was doing in Trinidad at this time, around this new and quite small party. But it was certainly surprising, indeed shocking perhaps to Sir Grantley Adams, when he was in Trinidad as the first Prime Minister of the Federation of the West Indies, when the DLP swept the polls in 1961. Barrow came into power as Premier for the beginning of what would be his 3 terms in office, 61 to 66, 66 to 71, and 71 to 76. He would have a brief period in 1986-87 before his untimely death. I could spend a very long time talking about the achievements of these governments, but I just want to summarize 1 or 2 key things. I think the first mandate is marked by the creation of a system of free education for all Barbadians, which was conceived not just as a business of removing school fees, but also, very interestingly, creating a school meals program. Because Barrow believed that it was not enough to give people a chance to go to school if you had schools in which some children were well fed and some children were hungry, if one really intended to create a level playing field. This is also a period in which there is a continuation of the BLP's program of house building on a much larger scale. And also the beginnings of the attempt to bring new kinds of industrial development to Barbados, on the model of Puerto Rico's tax mandates. Coming into 1966, Barrow leads the country to political independence on the 30th of November 1966, and he is able to travel onwards with the mandate of that fresh election into 5 years of considerable activity in the late 1960s, which saw such things as the disestablishment of the Anglican Church. Barrow believed that Barbados was an island which had many faiths, and the particular privileged relationship of the church to the tax base and to the state had to be broken in the interests of the democracy in that island. This is also the period in which Barrow strips the yacht club of its title Royal Yacht Club. This is the period in which he plans for a central bank for Barbados and breaking the link with sterling, and also plans for a Barbados defense force. The last mandate from 71 to 76 is characterized by significant international achievements. We can turn to the Treaty of Chaguaramas, when together with Forbes Burnham and Michael Manley and Eric Williams, they relaunched the project of Caribbean Federation in the form of the Caribbean Community. But their other achievement in 1971 was to go against the pressure of the United States to open diplomatic relationship with Cuba, and to bring Cuba into the Caribbean family, to which, of course, it had always belonged. That 1970s period sees perhaps the most significant intervention of Barbados in the international affairs of the world, when in the mid-1970s, the cabinet voted secretly to allow Cuba to use Sewell Airport as a stepping stone to Africa. So 48 years ago, Operation Carlotta, named after Black Carlotta, the leader of the slave rebellion in 1843, carried 100 Cuban special forces with heavy weapons via Barbados to Angola. Over 3 months, some 50 flights, 5 of them in a single night, used Barbados to send over 3,000 crack Cuban troops with advanced weapons, which sent the South African Defense Force into retreat from Angola and forced Rhodesia's white minority regime to the negotiating table. This intervention on the part of Barrow was conducted without consulting any international authority other than his friend Michael Manley and Forbes Burnham. And for that, he paid, I think, some kind of price. But it was very much in the train of the path which he'd set in 1966 in one of his most famous speeches, when he declared to the United Nations that Barbados would be friends of all, satellites of none. I think it's always important when we think about our heroes to also criticize them and to ask hard questions about the things which need to be considered as problems in their passage, possibly even in some cases errors of judgment. Perhaps the most articulate exponent of this is Hilborn Watson, who in 2 very interesting books has, if I can make a long story very short, has essentially argued that Barrow played, in a way, a very conservative force in Barbadian society, deferring, delaying, and ultimately failing to address the forms of social and economic inequality which characterized the island. That he played more a restraining role than one of liberation. Hilbert Watson is particularly interested in Barrow's role in passing the Public Order Act of 1970, which is a reasonably repressive piece of legislation in terms of the powers that it gives to the police commissioner to intervene with the freedom of assembly and to essentially to control forms of public political expression. This was an act passed in the context of the Black Power revolt in Trinidad in 1970. And we can look also at the change of the Constitution, which happens in the 1970s, which leads to the Prime Minister of Barbados having the extraordinary power not just to appoint the Senate, as in the Independence Constitution, but also to appoint the judiciary. So whereas in the theory of the American government is that you have three branches of government which are in tension with each other. The executive, the legislature, the judiciary. What you have in Barbados is the integration of all these forms of power in the person of the Prime Minister. It's an extraordinary example of the accumulation of powers in the Prime Minister. And it has to be said that we've been extremely lucky so far in our history not to have this accumulation of powers be abused in the way it might have been. But it represents a problem. Now, it has to be said that some of the most eloquent speeches ever given in the House of Assembly were given by the opponents of these acts. So if you turn to Hansard and you read the speeches, there's some wonderful speeches by Tom Adams, by Brees and John before 71, by Henry Ford after 71, by Elliot Motley before he jumped the House and became a High Commissioner, became a Consul General in New York. Some extremely articulate and intelligent speeches criticizing the authoritarian character of this legislation and the extent to which it was rooted, Adams argued, very plausibly, in the authoritarian traditions of colonial society in Barbados. But of course, once the Barbados Labour Party was in power in 1976, it took no steps to repeal any of this legislation. And indeed, no succeeding Prime Minister of Barbados, of either party, even though they've enjoyed two-thirds majorities, has sought to repeal some of this legislation in ways which would diminish the power of the Prime Minister. So I have to say that, as the Trinidadians say, we like it so. The impact of Barrow on the office of the Prime Minister in Barbados really cannot be measured. All of his successes, to a greater or lesser extent, were Prime Ministers occupying the role which he shaped. I think, for example, that if one looks at Owen Arthur, and especially at Mia Motley, the influence of Errol Barrow on their vision of the role of the Prime Minister is in fact far more profound than of either Adam's father or son. He shaped that particular role. In many ways, what they chose to take up as Prime Ministers were some of the legacies which he left behind and to seek to extend them. So I think, for example, that had Errol Barrow won the 1976 election, it is almost certain that he would have followed Forbes Burnham of Guyana and Eric Williams of Trinidad in making Barbados a republic in the late 1970s. And I think that were Barrow alive, he would have very much have approved of Mia Motley's decision to bring Barbados into a republican status. At the same time, I think Barrow would have looked at all of his political heirs, I'm not going to single out anyone, with a certain amount of unhappiness in terms of their economic policies. To the extent that Barrow was profoundly uneasy with the path of economic development which was emerging in the early 1980s. He gave a very famous speech in which he talked about the danger of the service station model of the economy, where we would view ourselves as being essentially providing services, but having nothing which we produced ourselves. He was very much in the tradition of Arthur Lewis in believing in the possibility that there could be some kind of industrialization, some kind of new productive capacity created in the context of the island, which would provide a more enduring basis for economic independence. He was very anxious about, he gave in this speech in Havana, where he went to the conference on debt, which Fidel Castro convened in the early 1980s. He was very concerned about debt as being the possible basis of an erosion of national sovereignty. Remember that one of the things which he says when he's speaking about independence in '66 is that Barbados has always paid its own way. Its revenues have always been sufficient to meet its expenditures. So that Barrow, I think, would have been anxious about the expansion of debt which begins after 1976, in the 1980s, into the 1990s, in the period since the 2008-9 economic crash, and of course since the COVID crash. Now, it has to be said that the governments of Freundel Stewart and Mia Mottley have operated under the most difficult possible international conditions. And it would be difficult to see ways in which they could have solved that problem in any way other than they did. But I do think that Barrow would be cautious about the balance in our political economy between revenues and expenditure. I think Barrow also would have asked questions about the fate of Caribbean integration. In perhaps one of his finest late speeches, given to the CARICOM meeting of the heads of government in July 1986, he declared the absolute necessity to promote and defend the solidarity and sovereignty of this regional family, and the obligation to discover those strategies and mechanisms which will ultimately lead to unity of action across our region in our political, economic, and social life. And I think that for him, the path to national independence in 1966 was only considered to be the prelude to what would ultimately be some kind of bringing together of a federal Caribbean nation. So that, it seems to me, remains part of the legacy that Barrow leaves pointing towards for the future. If we think of Errol Barrow Day as a day in which we simply celebrate the past and what has been achieved, we're not really understanding what Errol Barrow was about. And this day, and every Errol Barrow Day, we need to ask the question, what next? Where do we go next? In what ways does our society, do our politics need to be changed to produce a more just, more inclusive society for our citizens and for those to come? Thank you very much.